You've probably heard this about yourself or maybe someone you know. You're just in denial. And we all just kind of nod. We all know what that means, right? But do we really? Because in the many years of my clinical practice and sobriety, I've come to understand that denial isn't just one thing. It's many things. And most people who are in it, including myself for years, haven't even known they were in it. This video is for you. Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to do a beginner's guide to denial and addiction, specifically the types of denial and how to recognize them. I'm an LCSW with 25 years of clinical practice in the field of addiction and recovery. I've also been in continuous sobriety for over 30 years. I tell you both these things because today's topic requires kind of both lenses: the clinical science of what denial actually is and the lived reality of what it feels like from the inside. By the end of this, you'll be able to name which different type of denial is operating in yourself or in someone else you know. And naming it, in my experience, often is where things start to shift. Before we look at the types, I want to ground this in something important. Denial isn't lying. I want to say that again because it matters. Denial is not lying. In clinical terms, denial is a defense mechanism, a psychological process the brain uses to protect information that feels too threatening to process. It was first discovered by Sigmund Freud and later formalized by his daughter Anna Freud in their work on ego defenses. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that clinicians use, recognized denial as a core feature in substance use disorders. Remember, denial is a protective process, but for many of those challenged with addiction, it no longer is protective and actually has become destructive. Here are the key clinical distinctions. Denial operates unconsciously. The person in denial is not choosing to deceive you. Their brain is doing it for them, automatically. For those with a substance use disorder, it is the protection of the goal of the addiction, which, remember, is to continue to use. Think of it like a circuit breaker in your house. When the electrical current gets too high, the breaker trips in order to not damage the house. Instead, it protects it. Denial is the brain's circuit breaker. When the truth feels too large to hold, the mind flips the switch. That protection comes at a cost, but it starts as survival. So when we look at these types today, I want you to hold that frame. Not why don't they see it, but what is their brain protecting them from? That's a very different question and leads to some very different answers. Let's look at the types. I'm going to give you 8. Each one has a clinical name, and I'll give you a plain language kind of label that goes with it and what it sounds like in real conversation and what's underneath all of it, because the behavior on the surface is really kind of the whole story. We'll start with type 1. Type 1 is simple denial, the blank wall. Simple denial is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a flat refusal to acknowledge that a problem exists. What it sounds like is, I don't have a drinking problem. Not that I drink too much sometimes or I've just been overdoing it lately. It's really just a wall. No insight, full stop. What I've seen in my practice is that simple denial is most common in the earliest stages, before consequences have accumulated to the point where the wall starts to crumble and becomes unsustainable. The brain hasn't been given enough evidence yet to crack that foundation. It's primitive, non-complex denial strategy. What's underneath it? Fear of identity loss. For many people, especially high-functioning professionals, their identity is built on competence and control. Admitting to addiction feels like complete destruction of the self-image. The wall isn't hiding a secret, it's protecting an identity. Type 2, minimizing, aka the shrinker. Minimizing is more subtle. The person acknowledges something, but makes it smaller than it is. We are now building more sophistication in our denial strategies. It sounds like, I only drink on the weekends. It's not that bad. Plenty of people drink more than I do. The word only is a flag for me clinically. When I hear only drink, I listen very carefully to what comes next. Only is generally doing a lot of the heavy lifting in their statement. What's underneath it is fear of judgment. If I make it small enough, maybe you won't look too closely. Minimizing is denial with concessions built in. It says, yes, I drink, while working to keep you from examining how much or how often or where it's costing. If you've ever watched any reality TV shows involving questioning potential DUIs, you will likely hear, I've had a couple, to have you had anything drink question. And they appear pretty intoxicated when they say that. That is generally a form of minimizing. Type 3, rationalizing. known as the explainer. Rationalizing is the creation of logical sounding reasons for drinking. And here's where it gets clinically interesting, because rationalizations are often partially true. It sounds like, my job is incredibly stressful. I deserve to unwind. My marriage is difficult. Anyone in my situation would need a way to cope. I've been under a lot of pressure, but this is only temporary. The stress may be real. The difficult marriage may be real. The rationalizations take those real circumstances and uses them to complete explanations for drinking, thus preventing any internal examination. What's underneath it? The fear of being wrong. Rationalizing protects intellectual self-image. For people who pride themselves on reasoning, people who have often used logic as a safety net, the idea that your behavior is not rational is truly threatening. So the brain works hard to find the logic. What I know for me is that I was a world-class rationalizer. I had the language for everything. I had the framework for everything. Given enough time, I could wordsmith the perfectly reasonable rationale for why I should drink, or at least it sounded good in my own head. I know towards the end of my drinking, I gave up pretty much all types of rationalizing and just kind of leaned on the one, and that was, well, I'm an alcoholic and I should drink. What I've seen in my practice is that rationalizing is the denial that can most often fool some clinicians because the person sounds insightful. They can name the stressors with precision. They can demonstrate self-awareness in most areas except for one that matters the most. It sounds great, but a little inside clinical baseball here. Watch what they do, not what they say. That's the deeper work, not do you understand your situation, but are you applying the understanding honestly? Those are very different questions with very different responses. Type 4, blaming. Quick, look over there, the redirection. Blaming shifts the focus and the responsibility outward. It sounds like, if you had my marriage, you'd drink too, or my boss is a problem, not me. I drink because what happened to me. Again, there may be truth to those external circumstances. Trauma is real. Difficult relationships are real. So what blaming does is it takes the real circumstances and uses them as a complete explanation for the drinking, avoiding kind of any internal examination. What's underneath it is fear of responsibility. If it's someone else's fault, if it's their marriage, their childhood, their circumstances, then the solution requires others to change, not me. That feels impossible. My drinking becomes the only reasonable response for an unreasonable world. Why wouldn't I drink? Type 5, comparing, the yardstick. Comparing my drinking behavior to others' drinking behavior, specifically people who drink more as evidence that my drinking is acceptable. It sounds a lot like, at least I'm not as bad as Jim. He drinks from noon on. I've never lost a job over it. I've never had a DUI. The yardstick is always pointed at someone else and it's never towards me. What I've seen clinically is that the comparison group tends to narrow over time as consequences accumulate and the people around them start to pull back from their own drinking. The person in denial finds increasingly extreme examples to maintain the comparison difference. They take the most exaggerated prototypical example and apply it as the definer of someone who has a substance use disorder. Be careful of this in recovery as well. We have a tendency to look for differences instead of similarities. I'm not like them, so these meetings won't work for me. What's underneath it? Fear of exposure. As long as someone else is worse, I'm not the one who needs to look in the mirror. Type 6, bargaining. The deal maker. Bargaining is an attempt to establish control over drinking rather than address the drinking itself. It sounds like, I'll just drink beer, no more hard liquor. I'll only drink on the weekends. I'll never drink before 5 p.m. This is the early onset of chasing that great white whale I've talked about before. The fantasy of controlled drinking always seems to be within reach, but never quite arrives. The clinical reality is this. For someone who has a genuine alcohol use disorder, the neurobiological changes in the brain don't respond to rules. The brain is reorganized around substance, doesn't negotiate with timelines. What's underneath it? Fear of total loss. If I can control it, I don't have to lose it entirely. The deal maker in the brain is trying to preserve what it has come to depend on. Type 7, diverting, the subject changer. This one can be hard to catch in real time. Diverting is the act of deflection of any conversation that gets too close to the truth. Change the subject. Introduce a new conflict, or turning back the attention onto the person who's raising the concern. It sounds like, why are we always talking about my drinking? What about your spending? We've had this conversation before and it never goes anywhere. You're not perfect either. Things are getting hot, so we're looking for the exit ramp. Diverting is often mistaken for defensiveness, but diverting is more purposeful. Even when it isn't conscious, the goal isn't to defend the position, the goal is to exit the conversation. What's underneath it? Fear of exposure. The conversation itself is a threat. In the conversation, in the threat. Type 8, compliance with acceptance. The performance. This is one I want to spend some extra moments on. Compliance without acceptance is the externally cooperative response that contains no internal shift. The person says, often convincingly, "You're right, I'll stop." And they may stop for a period, but the relationship with the substance hasn't changed. The internal narrative hasn't changed. The stopping is a performance for a partner, a judge, or employer, not a decision rooted in general recognition. It sounds like, "Fine, I'll quit. Are you happy now?" Just invisible behavior change with no internal process underneath it. What I've seen clinically is that compliance without acceptance often precedes relapse. The person is given the external world what it's asked for, and the internal world, unchanged, is quietly waiting. I know for me, an example of this was I was getting ready to go over and do some third step work with a sponsor at one point, and I knew I was going to drink after I left, and I just was there to get through it. I was just going to give him whatever answers I thought he needed to hear to get me out of there as quickly as I could. I was just going to comply with what I thought was right in order for me just to move on. What's underneath it is fear of confrontation. If I agree, the conversation stops. And for someone not yet ready to change, stopping the conversation is the goal. Here's something you may be unfamiliar with. Denial doesn't come generally as just one. What I've observed is that people active in addiction typically run 2, 3, sometimes 4 denial types simultaneously, and they rotate them contextually. Different types for different people. With the spouse, maybe we use blaming. If our marriage was different, I wouldn't need this. With the boss, minimizing. I only had a couple at lunch. This isn't affecting my work. With the therapist, compliance without acceptance. You're right, I've been thinking the same thing. And even with themselves at 3 p.m., rationalizing. I've had a hard day at work. I've earned this. This is called denial stacking. Not one defense, but a rotation system of defenses that dial into whatever the audience is. Think of it as a defense attorney with 15 arguments prepared. Strike one down, I pivot to the next without missing a beat. The attorney isn't being dishonest, they're doing exactly what they're trained and prepared to do, and that's to protect the client. In this case, the brain is the attorney, and the client is protecting the goal of the addiction itself. This is why simple confrontation, "You have a problem, and here's the evidence," so rarely works. You're arguing against one's denial strategy while another 14 are standing by to go at you. What actually changes things is different, and that's where we're going to go next. So if confrontation doesn't break denial, what does? Talk about 3 things based on kind of clinical research and what I've seen in my practice. The first is motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is a clinical approach developed by William Miller and Stephen Rolnick that doesn't argue with denial. It doesn't try to overpower it. Instead, it rolls with it. It creates space for the person to hear their own ambivalence out loud in their own words. The core principle, you can't argue someone out of denial, but you can invite them to look. MI works by asking open-ended questions. What would your life look like in 5 years if nothing changes? That allows that person to generate its own cognitive dissonance. That's a very different process than being told you have a problem. The second, consequence accumulation. Denial erodes under sustained consequence, not under sustained pressure. External pressure, confrontation, ultimatums, arguments can actually strengthen denial in short term because it triggers a more defensive process. What breaks through over time is the accumulation of internal consequences that the denial can no longer absorb. That's hard for families to hear, but it matters. Third, safe relationships first. The neurobiological reality of defensive processing, including denial, decreases in the context of feeling safe. When someone feels genuinely understood rather than attacked, their nervous system regulates. And that regulated nervous system is far more capable of honest self-examination than a threatening one. This is where the connection pillar of recovery becomes relevant before even sobriety begins. The conditions for change are rational before they are behavioral. Denial breaks not when someone proves you wrong, but when you finally feel safe enough to see it yourself. And I want to close with this. If you recognize yourself in any of these we covered today, or any of the 8 types, I don't want you to hear that it's an indictment. I want you to hear that it's a map. Denial didn't happen to you because you're weak or dishonest. It happens because the brain was doing what the brain does. It happened because the brain was doing the best with what it had. It built a protection, and that protection kept you functioning until it didn't. Remember, no one worked on a problem they didn't think they had. What I know for me is at that moment I could name what my brain was doing, really name it. Something started to move, shift for me. Not all at once, but kind of the way things move in recovery, over time, quietly, and in small degrees. You don't have to dismantle the whole wall today. You just have to find that crack and let that light seep in. So if this episode pings something in you or for someone you know, I want to hear about it in the comments. Naming it is not the same as being defined by it. It is often where things start to shift. If you find this helpful, subscribe, hit the bell. I publish every week on recovery topics, and what comes next on this channel is built hopefully for where you are. If you haven't seen our episode on It Starts Early, the 3 stages of relapse, this may be a good companion for it. I'll link it. Take care and be safe.